You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Clio Digital Media, and support for this episode comes from the Massachusetts Historical Society, the first historical society founded in the United States in 1791.
It helps to think of independence as a three-legged stool or a tripod. You need a Declaration of Independence, you need a charter of government, and you need the recognition of foreign nations. It's worth remembering these are treaties of friendship and commerce, amity. That's what amity means. And the language of friendship, even love, pervades these. And in fact, treaties, sometimes marriage is referred to as treaties. I mean, treaties bring two separate beings, entities, nations together.
Hello, and welcome to episode 444 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. On July 2, 1776, the Second Continental Congress voted to accept the first part of Richard Henry Lee's June 7 resolution. Quote, resolved that these united colonies are, and of right, ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved, end quote. Also on July 2nd, the Second Continental Congress voted to adopt its unanimous Declaration of Independence, which declared the causes which impelled the colonies to separate from the British Empire and form a new nation. Now, while we often view the Declaration of Independence as the moment of the United States' birth, simply declaring independence was not enough to actually achieve independence or start a new nation. So the work of independence was not one dramatic moment created by the Declaration of Independence. The work of independence required the Second Continental Congress to build the infrastructure of a new nation. The founders understood this. As we explored in episode 443, Richard Henry Lee's famous Virginia Resolution of June 7, 1776, didn't simply call for the colonies to break with Great Britain. The Virginia Resolution set the Congress on a path to independence by calling for the creation of a Declaration of Independence, a plan for forging foreign alliances, and a frame of government for the new nation. Now, as we keep hearing, independence was really a three-legged stool, and the United States needed all three legs if it was to stand as a sovereign and independent country. So today, we're going to examine the second leg of independence, foreign alliances. Now, 5 days after Lee introduced his resolution, the Second Continental Congress appointed a committee of 5 to work on the question of how the United States would seek and forge foreign alliances. This committee included a lot of illustrious founders: John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, John Dickinson, Robert Morris, and Benjamin Harrison. The work that this committee produced in answer to the question of how the new United States would forge foreign alliances was a document, really a template, that we almost never talk about today, and that's the Model Treaty. Now, to help us better understand the Model Treaty, what it was, why it mattered, and the thoughts and ideas behind this template for foreign alliances, we're joined by two scholars: Sara Georgini, the series editor of the Papers of John Adams at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and Eliga Gould, the 2026 Harmsworth Professor of American History at Oxford University and a Professor of History at the University of New Hampshire. During our investigation of the Model Treaty, Sara and Eliga reveal why the founders understood that declaring independence needed to include a plan to become a treaty-worthy nation, how John Adams, the principal author of the Model Treaty, designed something genuinely new, a commercial alliance built on free trade and the law of nations, and how the Model Treaty worked in Benjamin Franklin's work to secure a treaty of alliance with France. But first, if exploring the founding era's big, tangled questions fires up your curiosity, then you belong in the History Explorers Club. The History Explorers Club is a virtual community for curious adults to explore, discuss, and indulge in early American history. No scholarly background is needed, and we'll applaud and thank you every time you bring up a cool historical fact. Now, club members get access to live historian talks, workshops, and a 24/7 forum where you can ask questions and discuss history. And right now, in honor of the 250th anniversary of the United States, we're running a sale. New members get 3 months free. To learn more about the club and to join, visit historyexplorers.club. That's historyexplorers.club. I really can't wait to see you there. historyexplorers.club. Okay, are you ready to investigate the model treaty and how it helped the new United States form its first foreign alliances? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historians. Today we have two guests. Sara Georgini is the series editor of the Papers of John Adams at the Adams Papers Documentary Editing Project at the Massachusetts Historical Society. Sara holds a doctorate in history from Boston University. Now, thanks to the MHS's trove of manuscripts by the Adams family and Thomas Jefferson, Sara teaches frequently on constitutionalism, founding era thought, and the course of Anglo-American empire. She's also the author of Household Gods, The Religious Lives of the Adams Family, as well as numerous articles for Smithsonian. Eliga Gould is the 2026 Harmsworth Professor of American History at Oxford University and a professor of history at the University of New Hampshire. His scholarship focuses on the American Revolution, with an emphasis on the entangled history that Americans shared with the rest of the Americas, Europe, Africa, and the wider world. He's the author and co-author of 3 books, including Among the Powers of the Earth, The American Revolution and the Making of a New World Empire, and the forthcoming Peace and Independence, which examines the Treaty of Paris, 1783. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Sara Georgini and Eliga Gould.
Hi, Liz. Hi, Lige.
Hi, Sara. Hi, Liz. Wonderful to be here.
Now, on June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee introduced the famous Virginia Resolution to the Second Continental Congress. Now, while we always remember how the Lee Resolution, quote, resolved that these united colonies are, and of right, ought to be free and independent states, end quote, we often forget that it continued to state, quote, that it is expedient forthwith to take the most effectual measures for forming foreign alliances, end quote. Sara and Lige, I wonder if we could start with why the Virginia Resolution directed the new United States not only to declare its independence from Great Britain, but to take the most effectual measures for the forming of foreign alliances. So, why did foreign alliances seem necessary to the process of independence, and why were they seen as the second logical step in declaring independence?
Something I think is so fascinating about that moment in late spring, early summer 1776 is that the goals of independence and alliance are intertwined in the minds of the founders. The idea that this impossible thing we're creating, a new nation, must be both treaty worthy and also have a treaty in hand.
Yeah, when I teach the Declaration of Independence at the University of New Hampshire, one of the things I'll sometimes ask my students is, what does it take to be an independent power? And this speaks to Sara's point. What if we declared independence in this classroom? And, it's sort of a fun game. But the answer is the first thing you need is the other nations to recognize you as an independent power. And recognition can take a variety of forms. But the one, as the Lee Resolution suggests, that Congress was thinking about was an alliance. So eventually they needed the recognition of George III, the King of Great Britain. But an important step on the road to that destination was an alliance with France.
I think what's really remarkable is how many ways they have to think at once in this period in June, July 1776. This forming of 3 major committees, often with overlapping members. We have John Dickinson running point on drafting the Articles of Confederation. We have Thomas Jefferson in the lead writing the Declaration. But it's not a Virginia delegate who comes to the fore when it comes to how to write a treaty. That's going to be New England's own John Adams. And when John Adams looks back on this moment, he is particularly proud of being the lead author. I was just selecting some of his retirement correspondence for publication, and I was really struck by John Adams' insistence that this is the biggest effect he has on anything the Continental Congress does. He writes to his friend and family physician, Benjamin Rush, in 1805, and he says that when he is arguing about the need for alliances in this kind of heat of the moment in the Continental Congress, I was remarkably cool and, for me, unusually eloquent. So our usual kind of candid, prickly, and very proud John Adams. But the idea that he sets forth about what an alliance can look like, how the model treaty that he is going to create is something that has no political or military ties, is something that is wholly new and based in free trade, that is a hard argument to put across. And he makes it very powerfully at the Continental Congress. What we're seeing in this model treaty is going to be free trade. It's also going to be the law of nations, suddenly with an American accent. And that sounds very different at home and to the rest of the world.
Speaking of Adams, I'd like to dig into how early Americans like John Adams understood foreign alliances and their function by June 1776, when the Second Continental Congress put this Model Treaty Committee together. Now, Lige, you mentioned that part of creating a foreign alliance is being recognized as a sovereign nation. But what actually constituted a foreign alliance in this period?
Well, there are two goals that Congress is thinking of. One, they want to trade. Though you can trade with other nations without being their ally. Being in an alliance involves a more intimate connection. It's a cooperative, collaborative relationship, and they're certainly thinking of that. And when you look at the model treaty, you can see that Adams and the other drafters of this, they're thinking about what they want to offer France in a cooperative sense, but they're also thinking about the lines that they're not willing to cross. And one of the really interesting things about Adams, he's very much pro-alliance, but he's also, I think we would call him a nationalist. He is tenacious in his commitment to American interests. And this will get ahead of ourselves, but when he's in France, he's actually quite critical of Benjamin Franklin, who also helped write the model treaty, for being too friendly and accommodating of France. And Adams is a nationalist, and in fact, he kind of irritates the French. Sara talks about his prickliness. The Comte de Vergennes would agree wholeheartedly.
Well, I think when we get down to the brass tacks of what's in the model treaty, some of the items that they need to tackle in forming it include how we define contraband, the idea that free ships make free goods, neutral rights. This is really important because Lige makes such a good point about the nationalism of Adams and his co-authors here, because John Adams is making a very particular economic point. He is positioning the American market as a free market open to the world. He is pointing to the fact that Americans have withheld their market for a number of years now in different forms of protest against British parliamentary authority. And they've done it very successfully in some ways. He is positioning a free market that doesn't totally exist yet. The model treaty is, yes, custom built, couture for France when it comes to diplomatic negotiations. However, it is also incredibly optimistic and incredibly idealistic about the economic future of the United States. It is a treaty that is rigged for, as he calls it, a perfectly neutral nation. And that is somewhat of an impossibility. He is dreaming of a United States that will not be, as he calls it, the football of European faction. But at the same time, how could this possibly be? When I say it's the law of nations with an American accent, it's not so much free trade, it's a quality of trade a little bit more.
Could we talk about the intellectual origins of foreign diplomacy? I assume there were examples of foreign diplomacy that the new United States, that John Adams was looking to, and perhaps it was looking at alliances that the Dutch Republic had formed.
Right. Yeah, the Dutch Republic is definitely one of the models. And again, when Adams gets to Europe, he doesn't get along well with the French. He gets along really well with the Dutch. And I think Adams just understands the Dutch. And the Dutch, by the time of the American Revolution, they had started out as Britain's close allies in the wars against Louis XIV. But by the third quarter of the 18th century, they really had become neutral traders par excellence. And in fact, would get drawn into the War of the American Revolution because of their insistence on trading freely, and Britain doesn't like that. So the Dutch, I think, are really important to how Adams is thinking about this. Intellectually, there is a long line of free traders going back into the 17th century, writing about this. I would say the most immediate influence, though, is America's favorite Englishman, Thomas Paine, in Common Sense. And that is the most influential, widely read pamphlet of the American Revolution. It had been published in the winter, right at the start of 1776. Everyone, certainly Adams, had read it. And Paine makes a strong case for the United States to be unaligned with any of the European powers. Certainly, he wants alliances for the purposes of defeating Britain. But long term, he sees the United States' destiny as a neutral nation, but a very powerful one. He has a wonderful line in Common Sense. He says, American goods and agricultural products will find a market as long as eating is the custom of Europe.
One of the things that always surprises me looking back in this period is that if you've ever crammed for a test or done the homework at the last minute, that's the case with the founders too. This very famous cohort is catching up on a lot of reading at the last minute and applying it. John Adams never wrote a treaty before. He knew that long lineage of thinkers certainly existed. He knew his Hugo Grotius, Samuel Puffendorf, Emmerich de Vattel, but he had read them on natural law. He had to go back in June and July of 1776 and brush up on his law of nations theory. He is just pulling this together in the moment as he possibly can. Now, as he's drafting at his elbow, there's kind of two reference works he's looking at. He's looking at a collection of state tracts, and he is looking at sea laws. So he is interested in property and commerce on land and sea. When he goes back and he looks at treaties, he is looking at kind of 10 or 12 treaties, 17th century, mostly Anglo-French agreements that his colleague Benjamin Franklin ticked off as you should really highlight and read these. He's not thoroughly happy with Franklin's input. Big surprise. Mostly because Franklin iterates a bunch of examples where France is not a player. And to Adams' mind, this whole model treaty must be angled toward courting France into a better working relationship. This is really interesting. The other kinds of treaties that he's looking at, and he's looking at mostly 17th century trade agreements, he's looking at the Peace of Utrecht, he's looking at the Methuen Treaty, he is looking at anything where France is involved or France is involved with a small navy nation, because we're not even a small navy nation yet. So he is interested in how do you deal with a major sea power if you're not one, because that is where commerce goes. So he is thinking very practically, but he is also doing the reading at the last minute and struggling to apply what he sees. Now, he thinks that when Franklin eventually goes to France, he goes wide. He is greenlit for one mission, but he carries off a second treaty he shouldn't have. And some of that is because you can see how they already differ in the reading they're doing. I often think we have all of these wonderful kind of programming questions about what would the founders do and what did the founders think. I am fascinated with what the founders had to learn on the fly, because often we kind of take it as accepted gospel that, of course, John Adams knew the law of nations. That was not a thing. What's interesting to me about the model treaty moment is that it is so formative for the rest of his life. He will never shut up about law of nations theory again. He will drag it into his public and private correspondence. It will ultimately cost him his presidency's second term. However, he becomes expert because he had to. So I think just remembering all the ways that people are struggling to adapt to the revolutionary moment, the model treaty offers us a wonderful case study of the personalities in play.
Before we dive into the specifics of the model treaty, you've both mentioned the law of nations. What was the law of nations, and why was the United States, the new United States, looking to become part of this law?
Well, the law of nations, on one level, it's an idea. It's not really enforceable. It's very different from domestic or municipal law, where you have a sovereign and courts that can enforce it. The law of nations is more a set of customary agreements and norms that the main European powers agree to abide by. But nonetheless, it's hugely important in terms of creating a common language, a language for resolving disputes. It's enormously important actually in commerce. And there, in fact, merchant agreements can be enforced, though they're enforced in national courts. So it's a set of customs. There is also a written law of nations, and that's the law of treaties. But even so, treaties are voluntary agreements. They are interpreted differently. There is a long history of nations making treaties and then disagreeing so much over what the treaties mean that they go to war. So all of this would have been in the minds of Adams and Franklin and the other writers of the model treaty. They want to get it right, but they also know that treaties only take you so far.
Yeah, and I think what's also important, I agree with all of that, is that this is a nation harnessing the treaty power for the first time. And it's not totally clear how this is going to operate. We know that we're going to send someone to France and they're going to do something, but who did they report to? We don't have an Office of Foreign Affairs yet. There's not a reporting structure. Who's going to commission them? Who's going to give instructions and credentials? There's a whole new system that's being imagined and implemented simultaneously, which is kind of the story of the Continental Congress in this moment writ large.
It's also the story of constitutional change. In fact, Congress is the sovereign. And the idea of 50 some odd delegates deciding on foreign policy, that's one of the things that ends up bringing the Confederation down and leading to the Constitution. And Adams will be a big leader in that process, too.
Okay, moving to the model treaty, how would you describe the founders' goals for this template that they're going to create for foreign alliances? Like, how did the model treaty propose that the United States negotiate its foreign alliances? We've talked about aspects of this. We've talked about sovereignty, a little bit about free trade. We've talked about the law of nations and being seen as an equal party, or at least a party that is not being kicked around like the football of Europe. So if you were to summarize what goals the founders had for their template, for their model treaty for foreign alliances, what would those goals be?
They're so vast. I mean, it's a great question because here in the model treaty, we see a new empire that positions itself as built on commerce, not conquest. And that's a myth we'll kind of tell ourselves for a little while longer, I think, in this period. But essentially, we want to trade. We want to be able to preserve our neutrality. We want to stay out of any kind of mutual defensive alliance. We do not want to become a protector of lands in North America that don't belong to us. We won't say to the French, we will protect your land here, anything like that. And we want to be able to define contraband. We want to regulate privateering. These are some of the items in the model treaty, essentially, that I'm summarizing here. These are the major sticking points in terms of how to proceed.
Another thing the model treaty does is draw a sharp distinction between North America and the West Indies. In fact, the drafters of the model treaty are willing to let France make whatever conquests it can in the West Indies. But in North America, another very important part of this, the model treaty asserts the United States' claim to all of Britain's North American empire. That includes Canada, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, or the collection of possessions that are Newfoundland, the Bahamas, Bermuda, and East and West Florida. And that's actually part of this commitment to non-alignment. And Adams is very clear about this. Paine is to Franklin. They all agree that if Canada remains in the hands of Britain, they certainly don't want it to revert to France. But if Canada in particular remains in the hands of a foreign power, that cross-border relationship is going to entangle the United States in wars and conflicts and complicated treaties with that power of the sort that the model treaty was undertaken to avoid. So on one hand, the model treaty looks like a peaceful, and I think Adams talks about this as a potential template for universal peace, but it's based on the United States occupying all of British North America. That is to say, parts of North America that to this day are not part of the United States.
I think the model treaty does one more thing, which makes the United States look like a full-fledged grown-up nation. Because although we have heard certainly in other episodes the debates here over was it an imperial crisis? Was it a colonial drive for independence? For a long time, it is just one big foreign relations crisis, right? Britain cannot manage what's happening here. Americans cannot resolve it. This is a step towards saying we are actually going to go ahead and sign our names on to becoming a new nation and end this crisis. And that idea, the idea that it has to be a treaty, but it also has to make us look very alluringly treaty worthy in the eyes of the world, is important. We are so carefully curating an image that we are imagining into existence with the hope that it's going to magnetize support in all forms from the rest of Europe. Because Britain has always counted on the North American colonies as a counterweight to a lot of European power. And we are ripping that away and standing firm on our own 2 feet. A little wobbly, yes. But I think that's certainly something that is part of the model treaty, showing that we are, what do I say, Lige, among the powers of the earth?
Can I add one more thing into that? I mean, it's funny. You asked us to say, what does it do? In fact, it clearly does quite a few things. I think the other thing that the model treaty does is it makes clear to the United States, in order to defeat Britain, the leading maritime power in the world, they're going to need a navy. And they're not going to build that navy themselves. Instead, the navy that helps them win that independence is France's navy. And there's a lot of discussion in the model treaty of the ways in which France is going to protect American ships. One of the things they talk about is protecting American ships from the so-called Barbary corsairs, the North African Muslim states that preyed on European shipping. But there's quite a lot about maritime power, and it's an acknowledgement that American naval forces during the Revolutionary War were basically France's, and after Spain enters the war, Spain. That's where their naval power is.
I think there's one more way that we could kind of think about the model treaty's impact, which is foreign policy drives domestic politics, right? So the men who were chosen for this committee, the diversity of their experience, the unlikely but happy union between Massachusetts and Virginia thinkers, this is all important because showing that you are serious about forming a government and treating with foreign powers raises the legitimacy of the cause and of the Continental Congress in the eyes of people who are, quite frankly, kind of tired maybe by now, a little beat down by how this has been going. This is an energizing moment, I think, on the domestic front. Always look at the power of foreign policy as it impacts the home front. And I find that really important. There are a lot of people who will not take that whole cause seriously until they see that it is engaging on the world stage.
And that's baked in both to the model treaty and, again, into Paine's common sense. The powers of the earth are not going to take us seriously until we declare independence. But declaring independence, of course, has massive implications for the internal structure of this union. So, yeah, it's very much a back and forth two-way street between the external and the internal, the international and the municipal.
Now, Sara mentioned that there was a committee behind the model treaty. On June 12, 1776, so 5 days after the Second Continental Congress heard Lee's resolution, they appointed a committee of 5 to work on developing the model treaty. And those 5 members were John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, John Dickinson, Benjamin Harrison, and Robert Morris. Sara, Lige, could we talk about why the Second Continental Congress chose these 5 men to figure out foreign alliances for the new nation?
So a lot of them have practical experience in Anglo-American trade. They, as thinkers and speakers, generate a lot of heat and light around this topic, and they're available. Well, there's so many people who are serving on multiple committees at this time. Adams, of course, is on the Declaration Committee. He is also presiding over the Board of War, does not know anything about that, but is in charge of it. So there are a lot of people who are kind of as available serving. Franklin, we know, is getting ready to head to France, so he is already tapped for that. John Dickinson is at just the center of a political tornado of commentary. He is always available to slam parliamentary tyranny, so that's a voice you want to hear from. And then with Benjamin Harrison, he has drafted replies complaining about parliamentary policy over the years. Robert Morris, he's the money guy, right? So we have a lot of people here who have a personal and public stake in Anglo-American trade and are really interested in creating this kind of diplomacy by trade through the model treaty. Now, Adams is at the forefront because he has argued the longest and loudest about it most recently. And he is really eager, I think, to kind of take on the task. We know that Franklin, of course, gives him notes. And I think that John Dickinson also does as well. I believe that there's some archival matter that's recently been found that kind of makes a link. But I would absolutely defer to Jane Calver and my expert colleagues at the Dickinson papers on that one. But what you also have here is one of those groups of odd couples that the Continental Congress likes to throw together, where everybody kind of finds their strength. When they roll out the model treaty, of course, it's Adams' cousin, Sam, who doesn't like it as much and is a loud critic. Richard Henry Lee has some choice words as well. And we see again the power of a foreign policy committee to influence local politics. This idea that Adams has of 13 clocks striking at once, it's a favorite one for many early Americanists with good reason, because everybody is not only in a different time zone, essentially, but has a different agenda of what should happen next. And so a committee this disparate with really nuanced understanding of free trade, of how world commerce works, that's the kind of person you would want to pull together into a committee, I think, more than anything else. Adams, of course, loves the opportunity to step forward and do this, especially because the Declaration is off his plate and the articles have kind of been claimed. So this is where he makes his stand. He's incredibly proud of it. I was reading kind of the reactions over time that people had, and there's a feeling in the Continental Congress that he opens up a field of view when he argues that they had not really considered before. People have been so tunneled in to thinking about Britain, and suddenly here's this whole world that they can connect with in terms of foreign relations. That is a new idea. France was always a hope. The Netherlands is the unlikely savior, I think, in that story.
The only thing I'd add to that is I think Franklin, Adams, partly because he claims it, gets the lion's share of the credit for the model treaty. But I think Franklin is a very important participant in this. And I think one of the things that we forget when we think about all the documents drafted in 1776 and in the case of the Articles of Confederation into 1777 is that they're drafted with an eye to the future, but they're drafted also with an eye to the recent past, particularly the 7 Years' War. And in many ways, what Congress is trying to do is get that imperial relationship that Britain had so clearly messed up with its parliamentary taxes right. And nobody had been more instrumental in shaping how Americans thought that relationship should be than Benjamin Franklin. He had written about the proper relationship between Britain and the colonies. He had spent years in Britain. He's very conversant in both British and European politics. And he has a deep knowledge of North America writ large. He had been to Canada. So I think that background is also really, really important. And there are ways in which the model treaty is as much looking backward into the recent past as it is toward the future.
I'm glad you brought up John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and even John Dickinson, because Congress had dozens of members to serve on these different committees. But instead of appointing other congressmen, they chose to have overlap on these three important committees from the Lee Resolution. So Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, they not only work on the model treaty, they're also on that other committee of 5 to help Thomas Jefferson draft the Declaration of Independence. And John Dickinson, he's not only working on the model treaty, but he's working on the Articles of Confederation Committee to draft that first Constitution of the new United States. And of course, Dickinson was completely unavailable for the Declaration of Independence Committee because he didn't think the timing to declare independence was right. So I think we need to ask ourselves, to what extent do you think these important documents and ideas really benefited from having an overlap of committee members' service? Or perhaps there may have even been some hindrances to this overlap that we should discuss.
Oh, I love this question because these are easily 3 of the most famous group projects in American history, right? Where one person does most of the work. At the Continental Congress, these men all figure out how to play their strengths. Adams is the talker, Jefferson is the writer, and then Adams can flip and suddenly become the writer. They kind of know when to do that and when not to. Lige, what do you think?
I think this gets back to what we were talking about earlier, which is the mutual influencing of the foreign and domestic. And in many ways, I mean, the Declaration, it's very much a public-facing, foreign-facing document. It is an appeal to the candid opinion of the world. Obviously, the model treaty is determining how the United States is going to interact. The Articles of Confederation are determining how the individual states are going to pool their resources in order to create a league of friendship that can command the respect of France, that will look treaty worthy to France. And so they're all interconnected. And in many ways, you want the same group involved in all of them because they're parts of the same whole.
I think it's interesting to consider the audience question too in looking at these three, right? Because the Declaration, as a piece of propaganda, as a press release of independence, as a revolutionary script people can hear and memorize and regurgitate grievances and creed, that's very powerful. It's not a legal document. The model treaty, of course, is something that the Comte de Vergennes can take a look at and absolutely claw away what we had planned. And the articles, we know, because of their weak state, are going to crumble in a number of years. What I think is really interesting about the model treaty is that we probably think of it the least of the three, even. And John Adams certainly felt he deserved more credit for everything, but especially that. And what I think he never really got straight in his head was that a model isn't the end product. And that this is just something that is kind of fabricated for the moment and that it must be flexible and open to editing. And where he first really sees that happen isn't with Franklin. It's later on when Thomas Jefferson tries to pull together a whole new commercial model treaty. And suddenly they've spawned this whole kind of early American literature of model treaties. And Adams, ever prickly, is so proud of what he's created that he doesn't realize there's a whole generation of treaty writers he is inspiring. So I think that's a really interesting kind of moment to consider the audience and then how it lives in the head of the author throughout their lifetimes.
The other interesting thing, and I think, Sarah, you spoke to this earlier, is that Adams's model, I don't know if I'd say it fails, but it's not the model that ends up being implemented. In fact, what results is an entangling alliance of the sort that Washington will warn against in the farewell address. And I'm always struck when I read the military and diplomatic history of the Revolutionary War, just how deeply involved in congressional politics and state politics France is. The Articles of Confederation wouldn't have been ratified in 1781 by Maryland if France hadn't threatened to withdraw its protection of Maryland ships from the Chesapeake Bay. I mean, France basically leans on Maryland to cast the 13th vote ratifying. So France becomes much more heavily involved in American politics than Adams had wanted them to be, that's for sure.
I think the model treaty of all the three makes some promises that are extremely hard to keep right away. And the first one is to be neutral. Like, this is a myth that we tell ourselves that we can keep running on and on with a perfect neutrality, because other powers in the world are not convinced unless you're invested at every level. It can't just be kind of, we both agree on free trade and other Enlightenment precepts, and isn't that nice? No, there's more to it. And it becomes a real, I think, question that bedevils us for the next early 50 years there.
There's actually a problem that still bedevils us, and that is the notion that commercial treaties and commercial relationships are not also entangling. In fact, commerce also entangles, and you can see them dancing around that in the model treaty, but there are all sorts of ways. If you're going to do business with someone, you've got to respect their laws. They have to respect your laws. There may be changes you have to make to your laws to accommodate them. That's another sort of myth that I think we still sometimes need to be reminded of.
That's such a great point. I was sitting here thinking about how debt and credit operates in the model treaty, or the regulation of privateering. Totally fine then would seem a little bit more like piracy to us today. The concept of monopoly is not a thing, or how insurance is treated, things like that. But I think the overlap between the three documents, to circle all the way back to your excellent question, Liz, is that no one document can do all the things. And they are trying so hard to create a federal canon, a system that can change over time. It is incredibly hard to create something brand new and sustainable. And that is what the founders are running up against, especially in the summer of 76.
To that point, it helps to think of independence as a three-legged stool or a tripod. You need a Declaration of Independence, you need a charter of government, and you need the recognition of foreign nations. And it makes sense that there would be overlap in the committees that are working on the beginnings of these three. You can declare independence, the other two are going to take work, but they all have to be there.
Yeah, you have to kind of backfill a government and a system at the same time you're raising the structure. It's incredibly difficult to do.
Could we talk about the model treaty as a document? Because it may surprise you. I know it surprised me. But when you perform a Google search for the model treaty, it's a Treaty of Amity and Commerce of 1778 with France that comes up, not this written template for foreign alliances that we've been discussing. So could you talk to us about the document that is this template, the model treaty, and what it contains? Because we've talked a lot about the things that it contains, but I wonder if we could kind of get a summary of what the finished template for foreign alliances looks like.
I'll take the manuscript question right away. So in the papers of John Adams, Volume 4, available in our free Adams Papers digital editions on the MHS website, you can look through Adams' draft, complete with all emendations, drafts, and corrections and changes, as well as the committee report, and then kind of the final version as ratified. So that is kind of the manuscript paper trail if you wanted to follow it and see all the kinds of little changes that are made.
Sara, do you know when it is published, though? I think that's the question. There isn't a Dunlop authorized edition or a Goddard edition. And I opened my book, Among the Powers of the Earth, with the model treaty. And I think I naively thought, well, it must have been published somewhere. And instead, I was in the Adams papers, which is great. I think there are a number of documents which only exist in manuscript that nonetheless are really, really important. But I don't know the answer to when it was first printed.
Well, I think it would be in the journals of the Continental Congress and in the secret journals.
Yeah.
So depending on how you have an edited version of that, I think in the 19th century, would you see it in the Force Papers or something like that? I would have to look that up. That is a great research project for listeners.
Yes, please look that up and email us with the answer.
Tell us where you found it.
But Sara, speaking of the draft that John Adams has in his papers, what does that draft look like? What kinds of clauses and articles does the model treaty put forth?
It's mostly minor wording tweaks. He is copying straight out for a bunch of the opening. I think the first 13 articles or so are directly copied from his reference books. So he's not trying to reinvent the wheel too much. And I think that's actually super interesting, right? Because we want to look like we are in the mode of being professional treaty authors, even though we are brand new to the game. So he is very careful to make it seem just familiar enough. And then he angles it toward France a little bit in places. Originally, the language has France in it. Like it actually says that straight out. And then when it becomes kind of the version that's adopted and ratified in September, it's A and B in the committee report. There's sort of a veiling of the intention, which is ridiculous because everybody knows exactly who it's meant for.
Now, in earlier episodes, we talked about the history of the form and how it became a big tool in the 19th century where you went into a store and you bought a whole packet of forms that you could just fill in the blank and have a receipt or a bill of sale or something already automatically filled out. As we think about the model treaty as establishing a model for foreign diplomacy, and you mentioned it's supposed to work not just for France and Spain, but for the Netherlands as well, is that what the model treaty looks like? Does it look like a fill-in-the-blank form with insert country here? How was the treaty a model, and how is it also ideas that the founders could pull from when they need to go and create these later treaties?
So when Jefferson goes to Europe finally in 1784, he does travel with that kind of a treaty. And it's a template that he will, use with Sweden, with Prussia, Morocco, and they're all commercial treaties. And that is heavily influenced by the model treaty. I mean, the only other nation that Americans are really thinking about in 1776 is Spain. Together, France and Spain will be crucial to the winning of the war. But I don't think the model treaty is yet that kind of thing, but it's opening the way for it.
I think the impetus of the model treaty to focus on trade rather than anything entangling in terms of alliance, you see that in all the treaties of amity and commerce that roll out with Prussia, with the Netherlands, with Tunis, with Morocco. It is, as you say, exactly a template, more so than a form. And the other thing to remember is that when the model treaty is drafted, there's a lot of concern that we are interested in doing business with a Catholic nation. And how do you phrase something like this? So there's a lot of questioning of, how you approach another sovereign nation with a Catholic monarch and how we're going to actually make that work. You'll hear repercussions of this when we begin to treat with the Barbary States, when we start to adventure down the path of a Moroccan-American treaty. And so what Americans quickly realize in the first 20 years of the country is the model treaty, like the Model T car, has to evolve, right? For our needs, it has to transport us a little quicker, a little better in different ways. And so they really have to figure out how to tailor things. What I think the model treaty gives us, less a form and more a form of diplomat. We start to see the creation of a diplomatic corps, and we start to really see a codification of instructions, commission, credentials. That is the form that is being created here, that diplomatic structure. And there's a certain kind of person you want to be your diplomat. I think all of that creation of the diplomatic and consular corps is so vital, and it stems directly from the model treaty.
Yeah, and this focus on forms is huge, and it goes well beyond the printed word. What do you wear? What will you be allowed to wear? There's this wonderful moment when John Jay, who has been commissioned by Congress to be the ambassador to Madrid, to Spain, and Spain refuses to recognize the United States until George III does. So even though they fight on France's side in behalf of American independence, they never make a treaty. And so Jay gets to Cadiz, and at first, the Spanish government won't even let him go to Madrid. And then finally, they allow him to go to Madrid, but he has to go in the character of a private person. But the final straw accompanying Jay is the returning French ambassador to the United States from Philadelphia. And they refuse to let him show up in Madrid wearing his diplomatic regalia. He too has to dress as a private gentleman, even though Spain and France are dynastic allies. Their kings are cousins. They couldn't be closer. The Spanish are even willing to diss the French ambassador to the United States to avoid doing anything that would make it look as though they're recognizing American independence. They're not going to do that.
Now, we should really talk more about the commercial ideas in the model treaty, because when you read the history of the model treaty, it's really the commercial alliance aspects that it offers that seem to be the most revolutionary aspect of what the Americans have created. So let's talk about commerce, but first, let's talk about our episode sponsors. For nearly 12 years, Ben Franklin's World has been a community effort, and right now, we're in the midst of our annual fundraising campaign. Between now and the end of July 2026, we'd like to add 50 new donors. And I can't think of a better moment to ask. We're in the 250th anniversary year of the Declaration of Independence and the birth of the United States. It's a moment when the questions this podcast is always asked feel more alive and needed. So if you've been thinking about supporting this podcast, now is the time to do it, especially if the show has become part of your routine or if you've ever found yourself going down a historical rabbit hole because of a conversation you heard in an episode. I hope you'll consider supporting us. 50 new donors by the end of July, that's our goal, and we need your help to do it. And if you've already given to Ben Franklin's World, thank you. And a return gift is always welcome too. You can make your first tax-deductible donation in any amount at benfranklinsworld.com/donate. That's benfranklinsworld.com/donate. Every gift keeps this work going and our conversations freely available to anyone who wants them. So thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about this history. And thank you for helping us continue to tell it. And a sincere thank you to Christina F., Thomas F., Heather F., Keith G., Sue G., Catherine G., and Koss G. for your generous support. Thank you. Thank you for helping us keep this work going. Sara, Lige, could we talk about the commercial ideas in the model treaty? Because through my research, it seems that the most revolutionary aspect of the model treaty is that rather than propose an alliance based on military support, the Americans, who have no military to speak of to support anyone, what the Americans do is they make a big part of their alliance pitch as a promise of commercial support. So would you talk to us about the commercial relations that the Americans offered in this treaty template that they create, the model treaty, and why the offer of commercial alliance seems so revolutionary in the 1770s?
So the headline is "Free ships make free goods." The idea that you are a neutral nation, Britain and France may be at war, but what you are carrying in your vessels is untouchable. Could be British rum, could be French wine. It sounds delicious either way, but you can certainly transport it and sell it and not be captured. There's another thing that is really important. And again, this is angled toward France, which is Americans will not pay a higher import on anything than the French do. So the idea that there's kind of an equalizing of what people are paying for goods, those are the two big things that stand out to me right away.
Yeah, I mean, those are both really important. There's a lot of talk about how the two nations will treat each other's trade in times of war. I mean, the free ships, free goods is part of that. But they also talk about what kind of access they'll have to their ports. I mean, they go pretty deep into the weeds in that regard. For me, oftentimes drawn to the reality that this treaty is resting upon, there is a way in which the French get sort of taken in by the Americans, because at the end of the day, the Americans still want British goods. I would say that in many ways, the French are being as unrealistic as Adams was in thinking that France could be drawn into this war without the United States entering into an entangling alliance. From a commercial standpoint, the commercial alliance with the United States is not a big winner for the French. They find that they don't know any customers in the United States. They don't have the connections that the British do. As soon as the war is over, Americans go back to buying British. There's a famous anecdote when Jefferson is in Paris and he wants a new bridle or saddle for his horse. And the only ones that will do are made in England. And he writes an apologetic letter to the Marquis de Lafayette and saying, if France made one as good, I'd buy it. So on one hand, we have this very liberal, open-minded agreement. And much of the treaty that the United States makes with France is very liberal. But at the end of the day, France comes out on the short end of the stick.
Well, and I think the United States is trying to do something that has not been done, which is imagine successful commerce without the protection of the British Navy. And that is going to be an uphill slog for the next couple of decades, right? The other thing I'm always struck by, when you read a treaty, it can seem very dry and it can seem like very repurposed language. But I try to look at it and kind of see the world in a grain of sand, because sometimes there'll be these singular instances of articles that reflect just the role of the individual in a world of clashing nations, just adrift in empires is this feeling. And one of the things that comes across in the model treaty always to me as just so humane and so 18th century is the treatment of shipwrecked sailors, that they will always be taken care of, that this is something where the good health of your fellow human being comes before the two nations at war. It's the smallest thing. When you look at the treaty and you think, oh, these big empires and all these ships, and then to suddenly focus on the one sick guy in port. It's just such a striking moment to me whenever I read the Shipwrecked Sailors one. I know we don't always think of the emotion of a treaty, but perhaps we should, because there's a great deal of 18th century philanthropy reflected in it.
Well, and it's worth remembering, these are treaties of friendship and commerce, amity. That's what amity means. And the language of friendship, even love, pervades these. And in fact, treaties, sometimes marriage is referred to as treaties. I mean, treaties bring two separate beings, entities, nations together. And there is a language of affection and love and friendship and caring that pervades them. I think that's a very important point.
In other episodes of this show, we've talked about the drafting of the Declaration of Independence. So we know that after Thomas Jefferson wrote his draft, John Adams and Benjamin Franklin go in and they help him edit out some words so that they make his draft less verbose and more powerful. And then we know that the Committee of the Whole, so the entire Second Continental Congress, they get their hands dirty and edit the revised draft that Adams and Franklin helped Jefferson with. They revise that draft into what is now the Declaration of Independence. Sara, you mentioned earlier that you were going through John Adams's draft of the model treaty. Do we know if the editing of the model treaty followed a similar process to the Declaration? And if it did, what were some of the aspects of it that may have been majorly edited or taken out?
Well, the heart of the debate is whether we're kind of overselling ourselves. Lige, would you agree?
I would agree. Yeah. I'll say what I'm going to say, and then I'm going to turn it back to Sara because I think she knows more about the actual editing process. What happens is some of the first party divisions in Congress are over just how closely the United States should adhere to the wishes and interests of its ally, France, or whether it should hang back. So this is destined to be a framing divisive question right up until the end of the war in 1782-83, just as it's a source of tension between Adams and Franklin. And when Jay arrives, Jay's actually interesting. He had been on the side of France when he was in Congress, but partly because of his awful time in Madrid, by the time he gets to Paris, he's decided he doesn't like the French so much. So he and Adams end up kind of forming an alliance against Franklin. But there is a huge amount of conflict. What I don't know is whether that shows up in the actual drafting. I think that may be one of those things that Americans had to learn. You talk about the things that they learn, and they come to realize just how divisive questions of foreign policy can be.
It's one of those questions where the manuscript tells you enough, but not enough. And it reflects some of the ideological debates, but not all of them. Certainly, when it comes to the floor, Samuel Adams and Richard Henry Lee think that maybe we don't even look enticing enough to other superpowers. Like maybe we need to do a little bit more to put ourselves forward. Adams is fairly conservative on that point because much like the Declaration, he needs an expression of the American mind. That is what he is trying to put forward. He doesn't want to sound too different, too radical. The model treaty is not written for the Continental Congress. It is written for the French ministry. It is written for the Comte de Vergennes. Like if he had just said, "Dear Comte de Vergennes," you probably would have had a more honest version than calling it a model treaty. It is specifically targeted a country and a moment where we desperately need help. And what they do not know is how it will be used by a minister abroad, particularly Franklin, right? And so just because you have that in your back pocket, how are you going to actually use it at the bargaining table? That's a huge question that is totally up in the air. But Adams does feel that even if some of the wording gets tweaked, his bright idea, the kind of headline in his head, friendship with all nations, but entangling alliances with none, that has at least sailed through the Continental Congress. And there are so many debates over so many things in this period. In the thick of it, it is such a whirlwind that you are picking your battles most likely. And they just need something to go to France.
You know what's really interesting about Adams, and I'm constantly reminded and struck by this, it is just what a brilliant writer is. So on one hand, he's making these arguments in committee, and while he's in Congress, he's a master politician. He speaks very well. But when he gets to Europe, he writes, and he writes, and he writes, and he writes. He writes a huge amount. And the recurring theme is the power and desirability of the United States as a rising commercial empire, really. And it constantly making the case. And, I think one way to think of what Adams does in those writings is that he is trying to hang on to that vision that his interpretation of what the model treaty is supposed to be about. Actually, one of my favorite Adams writings, Thomas Pownall, the former governor of Massachusetts, writes a piece in 1780, very much in the Adams vein. But Pownall is a complicated, impenetrable writer. So Adams publishes a translation of it.
I mean, Adams does engage with economic theory so deeply, even more so when he's in Europe, because he has nothing to do as an American minister.
True.
No one wants to do a trade deal with him. He hits brick walls everywhere he goes, in London, in Paris to a degree. I will say that he is certainly engaging with those ideas as much as he possibly can. That's absolutely right. He sharpens his quill for sure when he's there.
To go back to your point, Sara, Congress has created a model treaty. They could have written a treaty to France, but what they created was a model that they could give to the United States as new foreign ministers, its diplomats, and that it would be something to use to negotiate as they went to Europe to seek recognition of the new nation's sovereignty, commercial support, and, of course, in the case of France, their military support as well. That was the goal and vision of the model treaty. How was it actually applied on the ground? How did the model treaty perform in France, for instance?
So, I mean, if you're Benjamin Franklin, you're the most famous American in the world headed to Paris, where you are feted as a celebrity author, man of science. It goes okay. The problem is that Franklin encounters in the French foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, just an absolute spider, someone who has his hand in just about everything and who is willing to speed up or slow down negotiations at any point as it serves his own internal politicking, is I think the nicest way to put it. At the same time, there's a whole bunch of French politics that are also speeding up or slowing down Franklin's push. Now, Franklin does well with his first job. His first task was to have kind of a basic amity and commerce treaty. But then he goes rogue and he kind of comes up with this other treaty of alliance. And this infuriates Adams. And I'm going to say something here, which is in Benjamin Franklin's defense, he has to deal with something Adams doesn't, which is all of that French politicking, which is the Comte de Vergennes on a daily basis. There's a large part of the reality of European politics that Adams is not clued into that Franklin has to deal with. And one of those things is the question of what Spain is going to do. And watching Spain and France, as Lige pointed out earlier, and how they're maneuvering with each other absolutely affects what happens with the Franco-American treaties.
One of the things we haven't talked about is Adams does learn French, but he has to teach it himself. Whereas I can see Sarah shaking her head. He maybe doesn't learn it that well. Whereas Franklin does speak French. So Franklin, just linguistically and also by nature, is able to maneuver in Paris and at Versailles in ways that Adams just can't. Again, Adams is much more at home in Amsterdam. He does so much better in the Netherlands. And, I think it feels familiar to him. I don't know if Amsterdam's another Boston, but Paris definitely is not another Boston.
I think that's exactly right. Adams is familiar with the kind of kinship networks that come from Dutch banking families that mirrors his own New England experience. He is happy signing loans, asking for money. He really leans into the commerce side of things. And Franklin more leans into the charm and maneuver side of the diplomatic corps. So they bring different strengths in different places, I think, very much.
Yeah, and if you look at letters from this period, John Adams is very straightforward in his writings. He doesn't really mince words. And if you were to read a Dutch letter from this period, that's exactly how they operate in business. Whereas if you read a French letter, or even something that Benjamin Franklin wrote, but definitely Thomas Jefferson wrote, there's a lot more reading between the lines needed to really understand what was really happening, what is not being said, but what is inferred. It's almost a little bit like a game rather than a business.
Yeah, I think for sure all the veiled kind of references in French certainly appeal to Franklin. And I think that the candor of the Dutch bankers he deals with is more his style. But there's another thing. There's an age gap between them. There's an experience gap between them, for sure. And Franklin is so famous. John Adams absolutely itches to be in anyone's shadow. Right. And if Franklin's in the room, everybody's in his shadow.
Right. Yeah. There is that. Is it Henry Lawrence shows up in Paris and Adams goes to visit, and the first thing he writes is, Lawrence's apartment is better than his. He's constantly keeping score.
Well, now it's time for our segment 1776 in Context. So now that we're in the midst of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, I think it's fair to say that when we talk about the Revolution and the United States' alliance with France or the Netherlands, we don't actually talk about the Model Treaty. So in your opinion, Lige and Sara, how should we think about the Model Treaty and its place and work in the American Revolution? And now, 250 years later, where do you think we should place the Model Treaty within our collective memory of the American Revolution?
Well, so I think it's so vital because it's obviously the springboard to American foreign relations. It is a great expression of nationalist power at a moment when we are becoming a nation. It shows us kind of how America positions itself as a free market heaven, really, for the rest of the world to engage with, and suggests that America is going to be an empire built on commerce, not conquest, which is a different idea that is live in the world. Just as someone who spends a lot of time with John Adams and the founders, I think it's important to remember that the Model Treaty is another plot twist in the American Revolution. He did not plan on becoming a diplomat. Writing the Model Treaty made him one. So thinking about how these choices unfold and how the founders really scramble to do the reading and meet the moment, I find that absolutely fascinating. I think there's so much more work to be done on the Model Treaty and how it echoes. And where I would particularly love to see it is in newer historiography that's coming out about U.S. Native relations. And I'd like to think about why we have a Model Treaty for this continent and whether or not it is related to the one we prepare for France. So I think there's so much work yet to be done on it that shows the gaps in their legal worlds in 1776 and how they are racing to mend them.
So I have two comments. First, the indigenous dimension of what Sara just said. I mean, the Model Treaty does deal with indigenous relations, though it doesn't mention them, but that's what the claim to Canada is all about. Removing the contest between powers that had caught up Native people in them. And it's actually interesting, both Adams and Franklin say that part of this Continental Union that they want to establish, taking all of British North America, not just the 13 colonies that declared independence, will also bring peace to Indian country. I wouldn't say we should take them at their word, but the same peaceful claims that they're making overseas in terms of commercial relations with Britain, they're also making with respect to Indian country. The other thing I would say is the foreign relations of a nation, on one hand, diplomacy is messy, but it's also where we and other nations project our abstract understanding of what we're about. And the Model Treaty is a foundational moment in the statement of those principles. And particularly the rejection of foreign entanglements in favor of trade, naive as it is, the overlooking of the way in which trade is also entangling. Nonetheless, that has been foundational to American identity, and I think remains so. In some ways, we may find that it's becoming even more important in our current moment.
I think that's so right. I think you have a Declaration of Independence, sure, but the Model Treaty declares we are open for business.
Well, Lige, you're working on a new book called Peace and Independence. Would you tell us a little bit about what that book is about and when we can be purchasing it?
Well, I have a draft of it, Liz. There are a couple chapters that need some tough love. So I'm administering that tough love almost as we speak. I would hope it'll be out next year. My goal is to have the draft off to my publisher. It's being published by Oxford University Press before I myself leave Oxford at the end of July. The book is about the peace that Americans got and the conflict, the tension between the peace they hoped to make and the one that they got. So I actually make quite a lot of these claims to all of North America because, of course, as we know, the United States did not get Canada and Nova Scotia, nor did it get Bermuda and the Bahamas. And for, another 30 years, Florida also was not part of the United States. And that partition, I argue, forces Americans into a set of relationships, both at home and abroad, that they had hoped to avoid, including being very deeply entangled with Britain. The fears of the writers of the Model Treaty that the U.S.-Canadian border would be a zone of conflict and contestation were realized. It also, though, is where the United States and Britain first begin to work out a more amicable set of relationships. So in many ways, by having Britain in North America, it makes it impossible for Americans to fully disengage with that European world in the way that the founders had hoped to in 1776.
And Sara, you and your colleagues at the Massachusetts Historical Society have curated a new exhibit on that other Committee of Five about the Declaration of Independence. So would you tell us more about that exhibit and how we can visit?
Sure. Thanks so much, Liz. Definitely come by the MHS. We are open for free 6 days a week to see 1776 declaring independence. Our goal with this exhibit was to walk you through some of the most pivotal manuscripts and artifacts that tell that story from our collections. So you'll see what the mood was like in Boston. You can see some Boston Tea Party tea that we saved from the harbor. You can see the drafting of the Declaration, kind of the room where it happened with John Adams and Thomas Jefferson's early drafts of the Declaration with the grievance against slavery left in, which will be familiar to folks who've listened to Brooke Newman just recently chat about it here. And then finally, we considered kind of how the 4th of July has become a beacon of both celebration and protest. And we thought about everything from how Anglicans changed their books of common prayer to paste over prayers for the king and change it to the president, the Congress, and the people, to 19th century understandings of women's rights, of native sovereignty rights, and the cause of abolitionism. And then we finally close with some very new acquisitions from our No Kings protests here in Massachusetts. So we hope you'll check it out, along with some declarations, because there's a lot of declarations that didn't quite make it into the show, and you can see them online at the MHS website coming soon.
So Sara and Lige, as we discussed, the Model Treaty was really important, but it's not something that we think about all the time. So as we digest our conversation and think of new questions, where's the best place for us to get in contact with you?
I'm always happy to welcome folks to the MHS or find me on Blue Sky.
You can email me at my UNH email address, which is available on my website. I've been there so long, it's a very simple email address, ehg@unh.edu.
Eliga Gould and Sara Georgini, thank you so much for joining us and for helping us better understand the Model Treaty and its impact on the new United States.
Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. Thanks, Sara. What fun talking with you all about this.
What does it actually take to create an independent nation? As Sara and Lige made clear, issuing a paper declaration is only the beginning. New nations need other nations to recognize them. They need to be seen as treaty-worthy. The Model Treaty was John Adams and his fellow committee members' answer to the challenge of how to make the United States seem like a treaty-worthy nation. Where Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence proclaimed the political principles of the new United States to the world, Adams's Model Treaty declared that the new nation was open for business. Now, Adams and the other founders had a vision of the United States as a nation built on commerce, not conquest. They saw themselves as starting a country whose strength would come not from military alliances or territorial ambition, although the United States certainly had territorial ambition, but from free trade, neutral shipping, and the principles of the law of nations. As Sara stated, the founders imagined a new country into existence and hoped that it would magnetize support from Europe. That Adams had to brush up on his reading of the law of nations in real time as he wrote only marks the Model Treaty's outcome as more remarkable. As Sara and Lige showed us, the Model Treaty provides us with one of the most clear examples of how the founders improvised a new nation into reality. As Benjamin Franklin negotiated with France, we can see that Adams's vision for the Model Treaty fell a bit short. Franklin departed from the template that Adams created as he needed to secure an alliance with France. And yet, Franklin did use parts of the model that he and Adams created. In the end, the Model Treaty still served as a starting point for establishing a model of diplomacy that Americans would use for generations. A diplomacy that has led other nations to view the United States as a sovereign, treaty-worthy nation. And this brings us to episode 445. Next week, we'll turn our attention to the third leg of independence, the Articles of Confederation, the United States' first frame of independent government. How did 13 very different states agree to pool their individual sovereignty into a national government? What did this first attempt at American self-governance look like? Come back and join us next week, and we'll find out. Now, you can find more information about Sara Georgini, Eliga Gould, their books, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/444. Are you enjoying this series on the process of independence? If so, please tell your friends. After all, friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Joseph Edelman, Karen Wolf, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, do you think the United States still bases its diplomacy on commercial relationships rather than forging military ones? Can you see elements of early American diplomacy in our present day? I'd love to know what you see, so email me, liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Clio Digital Media, and support for this episode comes from the Massachusetts Historical Society, the first historical society founded in the United States in 1791.